Markowitz, and I'm the Webinar Coordinator and Marketing Manager here at Data Blueprint. We're so excited about our new format that you're going to experience for the first time today, and we want to give a special thanks to Shannon of Dataversity for hosting us today. We'd like to thank all of you for joining us on Making the Case for Data Governance. This is our first session in the new year, and actually also the first one in our third year of our data management webinar series, so it's very exciting. We'll get started in just a few moments after I introduce your speaker, although many of you already know him, and I'll also let you know about some housekeeping items. So as Shannon already mentioned, due to the large number of attendees today, we have everyone on mute, but we will be collecting questions via the public chat in the bottom left corner of your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as time allows at the end of the session. And to answer the top 2 of your most commonly asked questions, you will receive an email with the links to download today's material and any other information you request during the session within the next 2 business days. So keep an eye out for that. Now, about our speaker, let me introduce Dr. Peter Aiken. There he is. Dr. Peter Aiken is an internationally recognized thought leader in the data management field. Many of you already know him and have seen him at conferences nationally and worldwide. He has more than 30 years of experience and has received many awards for his outstanding contributions to the field of data management. He is the founding director of Data Blueprint, associate professor of information systems at Virginia's largest university, VCU, and president of DAMA International. Peter has held a variety of positions, 2 of them at the Department of Defense and Software Engineering Institute. By now, he has written 7 books and dozens of articles, and I think a new book might be in the works too. He's experienced with more than 500 data management practices in 20 countries and consistently named as one of the top 10 data management experts in the world. He's highly desired at conferences and workshops and always traveling to numerous speaking engagements and projects. We had some busy weeks closing out 2011, and it really felt like Peter was everywhere, including Europe and Japan. So, Peter, which exotic location did you choose for today?
Actually, Eileen, today I'm exactly halfway between you and Shannon. So if you just go east from where you are or west from where Shannon is, you'll find me right in the middle of the country here. So thanks, everybody. It's great to see so many. We've actually got a full room here on this end as well. Our topic today is making the case for data governance. And again, as always, this is brought to you by Data Blueprint, which is part of Virginia Commonwealth University. We are the largest university in Virginia, and Data Blueprint obviously specializes in exactly this type of material. We're going to cover a lot of material here, and what we've done is put together a deck that you guys can actually take back with you and try and give you some reference material for this. So the topic coverage is up on your screen here. You can see, again, what is data management, data governance, what is it important, what are the 5 requirements for effective data governance. We've got a couple of frameworks and checklists to look at. We'll also talk about some worst practices as well. A lot of people like to talk about best practices, but in some ways the worst practices are often the best models to use on these things. And then we'll dive in with a couple of examples and finish up with some takeaways and preferences. And then, as Eileen mentioned as well, we'll go for an hour on this material, but then we have a half hour set aside for questions and things as well that we can go. So we'll dive right in. Overview of this, you can see that data governance sits right at the heart of what we call the DMBOK body of knowledge. The DMBOK is DAMA International's body of knowledge telling what we mean by data management in this area. And what we do with this seminar is we start out here in the center, and then we move up to data architecture management and sort of work our way clockwise around the circle, finishing up around December time for that in here. Again, these are the primary data management functions that we're looking at in terms of how to put them around. We also want to make sure that everybody understands that the DMBOK also pays attention to the non-technical issues, what they call the softer side of things, which are absolutely critical in order to do this. If we ignore the softer side of things and just concentrate on the technical portions of it, we will have absolutely no luck with this material as well. This is all designed to help all of you out there in the community to become certified data management professionals. And we just happen to have one of 2 that we know of in Arkansas in the room with us here. So Ray, good to see you. We'll work on that a little bit, but Ray has already gone through and collected his, and so maybe he will be asking questions later on of everybody else instead of me on this one. Again, more information on this, you can see the links that are out there for you. We have about 650 CDMP holders worldwide, and we're trying to get that number up over 1,000. And we're really starting to make some progress because we're now starting to see job postings come out where it does say CDMP preferred. And that means that people with that designation get preferred treatment over it because it does represent a set of knowledge, skills, and abilities that we'd like everybody to work with. So on to our presentation here. I always start these out with what do we mean by data management in general. And I put this large complicated diagram up. Those of you on the West Coast, it's a little bit complex for before lunch, and those of you on the East Coast are already asleep after lunch and trying to see this. So we'll give you the management version of it. It really consists of 5 functions. The first one is trying to manage data coherently. It's trying to get everybody on the same page. It's trying to make sure that your data assets of your organization are lined up to support the strategy of the organization. After all, if it's not, what is it doing, right? So the second one then is how to share data across organizational boundaries. Now these boundaries could be from one program to another program. It could be from one part of the organization to another part of the organization, or it could be between our organization and our business partners. Either way, any of those pieces that we do, we've got to be effective and efficient about what we do in terms of sharing this. Third function then is data stewardship. Until we put people's names by specific responsibilities, we will not make progress in this area. So data stewardship is all about making sure that somebody is responsible for some portions of the data. Again, each of these will be covered in much more detail in some of the upcoming seminars. Our fourth function here is to engineer data delivery systems. In the past, this has always meant building new databases. But now we know that there's a lot of new technology out there. We can use portals, XML, virtualization, and other things to give us additional options. And I should also say, too, that the last generation of data managers have been trained by the colleges and the universities to only think in terms of relational databases. And some of you know now with some of the movements of big data and other things like that, there's a lot more options out there than just relational databases. But of course, if you train everybody, you know, that the tool that they use is a hammer, then every problem tends to look like a nail. And so we have a lot of that we've got to sort of combat as well. Finally, data support operations is making sure that your data is available when people need to have it. So that's our overview of data management. We do that every one of these. Next thing we're going to dive into is what is data governance and why is it important. So I'm going to start out here with a couple of different definitions, mainly to illustrate, first of all, that data management and data governance in particular means different things to different organizations. And it's really up to each individual organization to come up with their own definition of it. But let's look at a couple of them here just so we can get some compare and contrast on this. Wikipedia, again, a convergence of data quality, data management, business process management, risk management surrounding the handling of data in an organization. Not a bad definition there at all. Another one from my friend Gwen Thomas at the Data Governance Institute. It's a system of decision rights and accountabilities for information-related processes executed according to agreed-upon models, which can then describe who takes what actions with what information, when, under what circumstances, using what methods. Third one from my friend Rob Seiner, the execution and enforcement of authority over the management of data assets and the performance of data functions. That's Rob's group, KIK Consulting, on there. IBM has one, a quality control discipline for assessing, managing, using, improving, monitoring, maintaining, and protecting organizational information. That's IBM's version of it. And of course, then we have our own at the DM BOK, the exercise of authority and control over the management of data assets. Again, you can see here, IBM thinks this is quality control. Gwen looks at it from decision rights and accountabilities. None of us are in a position to be able to tell you all what is appropriate for your organization, but we want you to see these definitions. But if you do take this journey, one of the things you'll want to do is say, what does data management mean for our organization? And what that really means is you're getting some individuals, and I've got in parentheses there, whose opinions matter. Because if we don't have influential opinions in this process, we will not be able to do the kinds of things that we're looking to do. So getting some individuals to form a body, and again, this body needs to have some sort of formal purpose or authority that it's taken from, who will advocate, evangelize for, all right? And notice I'm saying not dictate, enforce, or rule. What they're evangelizing for is increasing the scope and rigor of data-centric development practices. So from that perspective, you ought to be able to find out something in there that makes sense for your organization that you can then use to bring into play what are the things that are going to be important for us to concentrate on as we start our journey down data governance path. Now, there's a number of umbrella components that we put in place here, and I'm just going to throw these up rather than talk about them individually per se. What we're looking for, again, are the standard things of integrity, accountability, and transparency. We're trying to make sure that strategically we are aligned, that we have appropriate amounts of standardization through various processes and procedures, that we have in place the very important component, change management. If we don't have people educated about this, they will not get that, oh, I didn't get that you guys had changed something on the database, and consequently, that's why all those jobs failed last night. It's not a pleasant situation that you have under any circumstances. Again, understanding how data architecture being integrated into the development processes, what the relationship is between data stewardship and quality, and then, of course, protection of your valuable data assets. And if you look at the map that we've pulled up here, what we're really trying to do on the left side is go through this one time where you assess the context of your organization, define some sort of a roadmap that makes sense for you, again, knowing that you're not going to implement the full thing the first year, but the first year is about testing the waters, trying it out, seeing what works, making mistakes, and recovering from those mistakes. And then at some point, securing an executive mandate where the executives say also, yeah, this is an important component. After all, we manage our fiscal assets in the organization. Why shouldn't we manage our data assets in the organization as well? Eventually, we will assign some data stewards, and then get into the process that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, which is really executing plan, evaluating the results, revising it, and applying change management as you would expect everywhere. Now, our DMBOK shows us a sort of framework on this, and we'll come back to this in just a minute, but just so that you can see how the DMBOK is laid out, on the left-hand side we have inputs, in the middle in the shaded area are the activities, the processes, and on the right-hand side you'll see the outputs that come out of this. And we'll go through these in more detail on this, but let's just look at it in context here. I take that little box and put it down on the corner and say, well, some of the things that we do in data governance are look at the various decisions that need to be made around data. For example, is this data appropriate to share with our partners? Is this data appropriate to share with all associates? Is this data, in fact, useful, or is it of dubious quality, for example, is another component that comes out of this. We also may need to look at data quality and inventory management. And we're using a statistic now that I haven't quite got my doctoral students to verify yet, but it turns out that about 80% of organizational data falls into the category of ROT, R-O-T. That would be redundant, obsolete, or trivial. And if you have 80% of your assets in that category, why would you spend a lot of time and money taking care of them? So again, inventory management is an important component to this. Finally, another one, organizational data performance. These are the service level agreements that we have with different parts of the organization, back and forth between our organization and other individuals. There's some other issues in here that we talk about, data security and planning. And finally, gosh, if we're not using the organizational data to help input to the strategy of the organization as a whole, what are we maintaining it as an asset for? Now, these are just some of the things that we can look at it from that perspective. A couple more pieces to help us place this in context. What's the difference between data management and data governance? And data governance really is high-level policy guidance. It's setting general guidelines and directions. It should not be onerous. In fact, as Bob Seiner likes to talk about it, he talks about a non-invasive form of data governance. Organizations are all about that. So, for example, we might have a policy statement that says all information not marked public should be considered confidential. Well, that's an interesting way to do it. It may work for your organization. It may not. Let's take a look at data management. Data management really is all about the function of planning and controlling and delivering the value that comes from these data assets. It's delivering data management solutions to the business so that the business can do things that they want to. Data governance is important because millions and millions are lost each year in productivity, in redundant, siloed efforts, in poorly thought out hardware and software purchases. It forces organizations that do not have data governance to be reactive instead of proactive. They're always running around fixing something instead of saying, how can we in fact prepare for things that we haven't thought about? We see an awful lot of delays out there when people don't have information or they have poor quality information in terms of what they're doing. And that through data governance, we can reduce the spend in IT by 20 to 40% organization-wide. For some organizations, that adds up to an awful lot of money very, very quickly. So those are the what and why of data governance. Again, you'll define your own definition for it, but those are some of the things that you can do with data governance. Now let's look at some specific requirements for effective data governance. And we have defined 5 of them here: accessibility, security, consistency, quality, and auditability. Let's take a look at each of these as we go through it. Accessibility. Can the people who need to access data get it when they need it? I don't know about y'all, but we occasionally will see organizations where they'll say, yeah, we would have made a better decision, but we couldn't let people who were making the decision see the data that was involved in it. Seems a little counterproductive. The other part of it is, does the data match the format the user needs? Something as simple as being colorblind can be a problem if you're producing a lot of color charts for people and they can't actually read the color charts that come there. That color blindness is a lot more widespread. And of course, that's not the only reason that you talk about it from an accessibility perspective, but there's a lot of things that play into that category. Second one then is security. All right, are people who are authorized to get it, can they get access to it? And are people who are not authorized prevented from getting access to the data? This goes back to the old days when we would actually hire the hackers and bring them into our fold so that we could find out what they knew and they could actually help us with the entire process. Are 2 users seeking the same piece of data actually getting it? This is our third point, consistency. It's not a happy sight when you're sitting down with a commander in the military, the U.S. military, and they ask a question like, how many assets do I have ready? And you get 2 or 3 different responses. It's even scarier when you have them hundreds and hundreds of units apart. And so, again, these are some of the things we've worked on at Data Blueprint in here. How do you rationalize these versions? The other part of this that becomes critically important, though, is reporting financials. Again, you don't want to have to go back and restate your financials based on erroneous assumptions, because that ends up with everybody with a lot of egg on their faces. We'd like to have data, of course, being high quality. And in most organizations, unfortunately, at the moment, most of their data is of unknown quality, and that's a problem. Although it is a great place to start in terms of your messaging, because if you are taking this message forward and you start out with a blanket statement that says, right now for this organization, all of our data is of unknown quality, which means the next time you're at a meeting and somebody's making a decision based on that data, you can say, now you do realize you're making your decision based on data of unknown quality. That'll get the decision makers to stop and pause a little bit and think, I wonder if we should perhaps look at the quality of the data we're using to make that decision. New Coke comes to mind in terms of one of those decisions on that. Finally, our 5th requirement for data governance is auditability. We need to have clear lineage. And this is as simple as cleaning our desktops off in the sense of the data environment, because I've already told you that 80% of the data out there falls into a category of redundant, obsolete, or trivial. So why would we manage it at all? But if we are going to manage it and put linearity in terms of, this also is called provenance in that context. You'll see it mentioned a lot. Do the IT people who are using it know what's being used for and for what purpose, and do the business people understand this as well? So those are our 5 requirements: accessibility, security, consistency, quality, and auditability. We then move from here now into what we call the data governance frameworks section. Now, I just want to explain a bit about what we mean by frameworks, because this is another way of helping you all get started with your ideas. So a framework is really a system of ideas for guiding analysis. It's a means of organizing project data so that you understand where things are going and what they're supposed to be doing. It helps you to assess the priorities when you're making decisions about what order should things occur and when and even if things should occur. And it gives us a means towards assessing progress on here. Now, I've put up what, at least in our industry, is the most famous framework. On the right-hand side of the screen there, you'll see John Zachman's version 3.0 of the enterprise framework. Now, this is not a data governance framework, but if you haven't looked at what John has done from a data management perspective, particularly this new one, which just came out last year, this is the best one he's done yet, and it's a phenomenal, phenomenal success. on here. We're going to go through 4 frameworks just very, very briefly here to take a look at them. First one is from Gwen Thomas again, the Data Governance Institute here. And the idea is, as you're looking at your organization, take a look also at these 4 frameworks and see if any of these make sense to you. And if they do, then consider adopting them. They're all publicly available. You can download them off of websites. It's not a matter of you have to spend any money on this to try out a series of ideas. So Gwen has 10 components in there, starting with the mission in the center there in that triangle. Then we move over to the goals and objectives. And notice also Gwen has labeled these as why and what, which is a good place to start. Why is a great place because it hits to the motivation button for people, and then the what gets into it as well, which gives us goals, metrics, successes that we're trying to look for in that. Out of that comes the third box, data rules and definitions, that start to talk about the how, which informs the data governance processes. You'll see we'll get to those in just a minute. From the rules, we then get to decision rights, number 4, accountabilities and controls on the side. These are 3 different ways of implementing different types of things. Decision rights, again, are somebody that says, I have the authority to make a decision about this particular piece. Another one, accountability, then says, I am accountable for these things. And finally, number 6 there is controls. I have the controls with which to make these. Many of these can be automated. Sometimes you want to do that, sometimes you don't. Again, it's going to differ from organization to organization. Number 7 then in her framework is the data stakeholders. We start to identify them. And again, the goal with all of this is don't try and do it all at once. Start small, work your way out from the center, see how it's working in there. So rather than trying to identify every stakeholder in the organization, try for the top 3 or the top 5. See how that works out. Then number 8 is establishing some sort of data governance office in that context. By the way, there is a data governance professionals organization, DGPO, that you can look up on the web and see that, which is a LinkedIn group that can discuss some of these things. And out of that data governance office, number 9 is the data stewards. We're now going to officially appoint people where it says, individual X, you're responsible for data Y under these sets of circumstances. And then finally, 10, you build the data governance processes that organize around this. And notice Gwen links it back into business and IT processes that touch the data, but it really is a larger management issue. Excuse me. So that's our first framework that we look at on this. Second one's from Rob Seiner here again. He's got a little bit different perspective on this, where he breaks this up into the enterprise, the tactical level, and the operational level portions of things. And you can see on the top of that, there's a data governance program team that is responsible for implementing this top-down in the organization and has connections to the executive steering committee of the organization. Then at that top level as well, we have some specific IT resource experts that understand and can help us point to the various facets of data and the different aspects of how data is working within our organization, giving us a strategic level data governance council. Then we move down to the tactical level, which says we're going to have domain stewards and specific coordinators depending on how the organization is set up, and then operational level. Now, some organizations are very small and they don't need to break between the tactical and operational, and others might be very large, in which case it's very appropriate to break them out into different levels. Notice the side we have the data program team on the left-hand side, along working in conjunction with the IT resource experts, and then we have the various pathways of communication that occur on the right-hand side of this. Again, these are just ideas to help you start thinking about what your organization should look like as you put this together. IBM's version, remember, they look at it as a quality control discipline, so they tend to see this coming up under a risk data council. Again, depending on your organization, that may be more or less appropriate, but that their data risk perspective comes on the left-hand side there, and you see we have data quality liaisons, metadata liaisons, technical liaisons, business liaisons in there that end up being part of project teams. And each of those is then instantiated appropriately into the various lines of business, where we have various steward functions and things like that that work through there. Finally, again, I mentioned this one at the beginning, we have sort of just from an IPO perspective, input, out, process, output, the DIMBOK framework in here. And again, you can look on the left-hand side and see their specific inputs, people who are supplying the data, specific types of participants, and we will go through the activities in just a little bit. Producing deliverables that consist of data policies, standards, resolved issues is an important one, because after all, in 3 or 4 years, hopefully things are under control and you won't have any data oopsies. But if you have data oopsies, it's actually important to show how the Data Governance Council has resolved whatever the oopsies are as they're going through that. Some organizations call them toe stubs, whatever it is you want to call them, but it's something that didn't happen the way it was supposed to. Finally, at the bottom right-hand corner, too, we have metrics, measures. Somewhere we're trying to get to what does data mean to the organization. Now, it turns out that we can actually put a value on some of these things. For example, for $100, I can go out on the internet and buy a credit card number. It won't be mine. But that at least tells you there's some value that somebody has put on that data, and we can start doing that in our organizations as well. Look at another aspect of it, too. In an organization with a lot of employees, one of the things they'll have is an HR person that keeps track of the HR group. Well, is data any less easy to manage than people? I'm not sure sometimes, but we ought to have at least some proportional representation in there. Say, if you've got 20 people that are managing the HR group in there, you've only got one person managing the data, it's probably disproportionate somewhere in there. So those are 4 different types of frameworks that we can look at in here. You can go back and bounce it off and try them on yourself and see which ones are going to work under which circumstances for which types of activities that we have. Now we move on to a checklist. I just want to make sure we give credit here to the checklist. This was actually came from a federal government Department of Education in here. And we're going to spend a little bit of time going through this, but you can download their checklist right from that URL that they have here. This is a summary of it. Again, decision-making authority, standards and procedures, data inventories, content management, records management, quality, access, security, and risk management are the things that are important for them. And interestingly enough, the federal government is actually a bit ahead of most of the rest of the world in these areas. So what do we mean by decision-making authority? Well, from a checklist perspective, we have to make sure that we have assigned the appropriate levels of authority to the stewards, that they aren't powerless, that they can, when they are empowered to make a decision, they make a decision, and somebody doesn't like it, that's okay. There's a little bit of pain that's involved with getting control over some of these activities that we have not been able to do in the past. We want to really have those focused to be as proactive as we possibly can. Second one, data standards and procedures. What are the things we're putting in place where we should? And again, the idea here is not to define standards for everything that you have, but to find the things that are important and to work out. Eventually, you will get to the point of diminishing returns, in which case the data governance organization can simply say, we're not going to cover that type of data, which is fine. It makes perfectly good sense to not waste time and attention on things that are below that level of a threshold. We do need an inventory of all data that requires protection, which means you probably have to examine all your data at some level somewhere in the process. It means that we're going to have to keep track of these things. Now, this actually is a Sarbanes-Oxley requirement, although most organizations are not, in fact, using this. But the official process for doing Sarbanes-Oxley means that you have to maintain definitions of your key systems, and they have to be reported out on your K-1 forms when they're filed. Now, when you list something as a key system is defined as people, processes, hardware, software, and data. So the data inventories become part of those processes as well. Data content management. What are the types of things that we're looking at in terms of maintaining content in here? What are the reasons for it? Now, this goes back to a very simple thing. When we're doing any sort of data modeling or data mapping activities, one of the things that Clive Finkelstein taught me is that we have to have a purpose for it, because if we have no purpose for it, then any answer will actually help us to succeed. So on all the modeling and things that we do and analysis we do, we are guided by a purpose statement, and this purpose statement drives then into this data content management. So it's not just a collection of data, but a collection of data that is maintained for the purpose of supporting this or that particular aspect of strategy in the organization. Records management, another important category here. These are the way in which we're going to now manage that data content with these specific records of data. Records, of course, are collections of individual data items that we put together. Quality, again, I've already mentioned it once. We'll come back to it a number of different times as we go through the year on this. If your data is of unknown quality, then one of the first things you need to do in your organization is to start converting some of the unknown quality data into known quality data. After all, if you're making decisions based on unknown quality data, you have then no choice but to question the quality of the decision that was made as well. Data access. Again, from the checklist perspective, what we're looking for specifically here is trying to say what and how many levels of individuals do we need to have. Again, the goal is to make sure people who should be able to get to it can, and those who shouldn't can't. But if we make a incredibly difficult 100-level data access piece that nobody can figure out, we've probably overburdened the system and nobody will pay attention to it anyway because everybody will go around the system. Try 3 to 5 levels of data access, see how it works for your organization. Data risk and security. Again, if we're going to have this data get disclosed, what types of things are we subject to? Organizations that self-insure are going to take a different perspective than organizations that have external insurance types of things. Those organizations will typically be able to give you guidelines. If you're self-insuring, you have to figure those guidelines out for yourself. And that is going to make a difference in terms of paying attention to that. So that's our checklist here. Again, moving fairly quickly here, we now have through some worst practices. And I want to give you this next example here in the hope that you'll be able to find something in your organization that will be a comparable idea. Now, I was in Japan about 2 months ago, and I took a picture of this Mizuho Securities building here that we're going to talk about on this because it's still one of the biggest brokerage firms in Japan. And the story goes very simply like this. There was a trader who wanted to sell one share of a stock. The stock was called, it's over on the right-hand side there, JCOM, for 600,000 yen. That was about 3,000 British pounds or about $4,500 worth of it. Unfortunately, the trader had fat fingers and he sold 600,000 shares for 1 yen. Now, that's an oopsie in a major, major sort of way. $350 million loss in this particular instance. And more importantly, from Mizuho Securities' perspective, their in-house system didn't have limit checking. So there's things that we could put in place as a trading house and simply say we're never going to sell any shares that trade below $1. Right? So if you do sell something for a penny, that's not going to work, and hopefully the system will catch it at that point. In addition to that, the Tokyo Stock Exchange also didn't have any limits on it as well, so it slipped out of the Mizuho security system and went straight over to this Tokyo Stock Exchange, and the Tokyo Stock Exchange didn't have any way of canceling orders. Well, again, oops. Now, the point here is that every organization has some examples of this. I do another example where I talk about a chocolate-producing organization that couldn't sell chocolate at the holiday season. Again, those are going to be problematic as well in order to do this. Every organization has some examples here. My point here is find them, because if you say, if we had proper data governance in place, this never would have occurred. And I can guarantee you the folks at Mizuho Securities actually, because Japan is a country where we have a lot of people not wanting to lose face and things like this, they have absolutely terrified that people are running around talking about this example over the world over. You don't have to tell anybody else about your example, your oopsie, but do tell it internally. At the chocolate company, when I go back there to visit them, as I do periodically, one of the things that will happen is we're sitting around at the table talking about an issue, and one of the executives will say, Aiken, is this one of those chocolate stories again? Like, yes, this is exactly that. They've got it in their minds. Chocolate story, really bad outcome for the organization. Better pay attention to this particular example here. And the reason for that is because the research that we've done simply shows that only about 10% of all organizations are achieving a positive return on their investment in this data governance initiative. That a lot of organizations are trying and are achieving some positive returns. That's 30% over on the right-hand side of that diagram. But a full 70% of them are not achieving any returns or achieving very little return on investment. And what that means is a couple of things. First of all, if you're in a competitive situation and your competitors are in that 70% and you're in that red square there of the 20%, you want to take whatever steps you can to move into that 10% because you will be in, first of all, 1 in 10 companies in your industry. But secondly, this can be the difference between a sustained competitive advantage and just regular old slugging it out in the marketplace. So let's look a little bit at the 10 worst practices that are occurring in here. Again, I've got a list of them here: buy-in but not committing, ready, aim, fire, trying to solve the world hunger or boil the ocean, the Goldilocks Syndrome, committee overload, failure to implement, not dealing with change management, assuming that technology alone is the answer, not building sustainable and ongoing practices, or ignoring the shadow systems that are out there. Let's take the first one. Again, if data governance is strictly an IT-led initiative, we're not going to succeed. This is something the business has to understand. In fact, there's a couple of terrific articles out there on the web. I think we've got them in our references section, where it's quite provable that business kind of looks at IT and says, I thought you guys were taking care of that, whereas IT said, well, no, we got you access to the servers and the databases. The rest of it's up to you. So there's this tremendous gap where everybody thinks everybody else is handling this. Governance has to be recognized as a priority, and in more organizations we're seeing this is now starting to report up through the business side and not necessarily up through the technology side, although in almost all organizations it originates in the technology side, although I have had a few business-led organizations that come into this in order to do it. So again, buy-in but not committing. Yeah, sure, we'll do it, but not really now because this project's more important and we can't wait for you guys to get your act together, kind of thing. Which also brings up another component of this. Again, where I see organizations making big mistakes is that they try to be comprehensive about it. All right, we're going to roll this out and it's going to be perfect, right? Well, I'm sorry, the first version of any system is never perfect. So let's roll it out in phases, let's test it, let's make people understand that we're in fact doing this as an experiment and we're going to try and do it a little bit and get better as we move our way through it. Second piece, ready, fire, aim. We've got some organizations that actually just do the fire and then they go aim and then they go ready, right? This depends on what's happening. It's good that you create the committees, but the problem is people get assigned to something and then they say, okay, now I'm responsible for it without the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities. One of the organizations that I looked at, it was an organization, very large organization, and they had as one of their data governance pieces that they were going to put in place something that said that they're going to move to SOA, and they were going to move all their applications to SOA by 2035. Well, a good governance organization is going to say, look, SOA's got appropriate uses, but not everything on this. And by the way, 2035, that's just kicking the can down the road to somebody else's problem. I don't know what we're going to be doing in 2035, but I can guarantee you it won't look a whole lot like what we're doing right now. So again, see the timing of this correctly. Roll it out gradually. Don't try to set it up so that everybody gets it right and perfectly the first time. It's certainly not going to happen in 90 days. You're certainly not going to solve world hunger or boil the ocean. Okay, great. We've got an inventory of all our data. Now I want you to go out and tell me what the quality of each of those data items is. Well, if you've got SAP out of the box has more than 200,000 individual data items in it. Just starting with that, it's going to take you a long time to do those. And again, not all of them are important or relevant. So try to find out what are the biggest data problems, what are the ones that are most visible, what are the ones where management will be paying attention to it on it. But don't try and solve the whole thing all at once. Goldilocks Syndrome is, mama bear, papa bear, baby bear, and this one's too hot, this one's too cold, and then there's the just right one in the middle. Goldilocks refers to people going from one extreme to another. Oh my gosh, we've had no data governance, so I want you to stand up a data governance program in the next 2 weeks. Well, okay, you can put something in place that would go in 2 weeks, but it's not going to be the right stuff. You need a lot more than 2 weeks to do this. So you've got to find a very happy compromise between what you're doing from a data governance perspective and show how this can create real business value as opposed to simply top-down trying to specify it within there. Committee overload is the fifth worst data governance practice. Again, too many committees talking about too much stuff and not really getting anything done. The proper committee size is really 6 to 12 people in the organization who are focusing in on some issues and realizing that there's going to be a lot of things that they will not want to address right away, which means maintaining a good checklist and coming back to the things that we have to get done eventually. Too many people, too many politics, you end up with watered down responsibilities that just doesn't end up working. Another one is that if all of these are created but not used, everybody gets an exemption, for example, on it, you're never going to have anything happen. Until you start holding people's feet to the fire in a reasonable fashion, then you're not going to have a complete feedback loop, and you'll never be able to tell what works and what doesn't work on this. So it's critical to establish ongoing communication to prevent business users in particular from going back to their old habits. But actually, it's just as good from the developer's perspective as well to point that out. Change management is crucial. Organizations with really well-run data management groups already have change management in place, and they understand the importance of it, but the rest of the groups probably do not or will not. So again, making sure they understand that that was last year's definition, but we're now using a different definition this year, and if you don't get this one right, you will have the wrong information going out to the wrong sets of groups. Again, number 8, assuming that technology alone is the answer, that's the surest way to have this thing be deaf. You've got to go to the business community. By the way, when you do go to the business community, they will come back to you and say, thank you. We've been waiting for this. We didn't have any idea what was going on over there. At least we have a forum that we can start to talk to people about and use this type of place and context here. Again, number 9, not building sustainable and ongoing practices. Yeah, I've got a 1-year budget, and at the end of that 1 year, the money's going away unless you prove yourselves. Well, it's going to take a while for that to prove itself in there. But at the same time, you don't want to have to say we're going to build out data governance that's going to be comprehensive for the entire organization. The first year of data governance should be about servicing one area of the business, one aspect of the business. When you get that right, then get the business to go back. You'll be amazed how often they will go knocking on the doors of management and say, we want that discipline that occurred in this area to now be applied in this area, and we're willing to pony up some of our money if you guys are willing to come in and split the bill with us on this. Finally, the last one here is the shadow data syndrome. Now, this is what we call shadow IT. There's an awful lot of places that have people that have their own SQL Server implementations underneath their desks, and they're doing tremendously good work, but it's outside of the governance sphere. And if we don't have the ability to bring that back into the governance sphere, we will not be able to capture the good things that they're doing and to eliminate the bad things that they're doing. So those are our worst practices. Now we'll work our way through the data governance building blocks. Again, the way we do this here, as I mentioned before, we're going to go all the way down the left-hand side of this chart over the next 12 months. And we're going to talk specifically about goals and principles, activities, specific deliverables, roles and responsibilities, technology that's useful, all sorts of practices and techniques, and what impact the culture will have on it as well. And we do these for each of the areas that we do. So from a goals and principles perspective, what data governance is all about is to define, approve, and communicate data strategies, policies, standards, architectures, procedures, and metrics. 2 parts: build it, approve it, and then communicate it. I said 2 parts. That's really 3 parts in there. I can count, honest. Another component of that is, by the way, we want to do some of this because it makes sense, but there's some other parts of this that we have to do by law. So find out what are the regulatory and compliance issues that we need to have in place in order to do this as well. If we don't have those pieces, we can have a terrific data governance story, terrific data governance organization, and still have one of the federal bodies mad at us for one reason or another because we didn't pay attention to hazardous waste data or something else like that. Again, from a goals and principles perspective, it's to sponsor, track, and oversee the delivery of data management projects. Now, in most organizations, the data management group works really hard, and nobody has a clue what they do, right? It's just, yeah, we got some people doing some database stuff, but I don't know what they do. If the data governance group starts to tell how often they change the databases, how quickly they're able to respond to these things, the business will go, wow, okay, that's good. They're actually kind of good at what they do. In fact, executives like to compare measures at the top level, and if they say, well, it takes me, about 4 weeks to introduce a new product. One of the manufacturing companies I was working with had that sort of a challenge. And the comparable executive at another organization said, oh, yeah, we used to have that problem with our SAP system too, but our data management group got a hold of it, and we've now got the process for introducing new products down to a 3-hour meeting. Okay, 4 weeks, 3 hours. You can see who's going to get to their cheese, first of all, in that type of a context. We will, from time to time, have data-related issues come up. And when they do, this is the group that is responsible for them and is best equipped to actually turn around and make people understand how that is. And finally, this group is also the one that can now start to articulate the value of the data assets and to say to them, Do you realize that for every minute our system's being down, we can't do this, or for every change we make here, it costs us X, Y, and Z, or to fit that software package that you're proposing to bring into our organization and to make it work for our organization, it's going to take a whole lot of rework, in fact, more than the cost of the package to actually implement the changes that want to occur in there. I found that in a number of different instances. So what are the activities in data governance? Again, understanding the enterprise strategic data needs. You're not going to get that from a 2-week exercise of going out and looking around the organization. You will come up with a very good starting point for that, but only by putting years of expertise into this, by having continuity and consistency there, you will now have people that start to say, I really do have a good perspective on what the enterprise data needs are. But again, it's a long-term process. You're not going to get it quickly. No consultants that can come in from the outside and tell you what that's going to be about. It's going to be looking at it from your perspective because it's your organization. Finally, you're going to have a maintain and develop the data strategy. Again, same comments here. Yes, we'll get a two-week version of it that will come out in the first piece of this. But to make sure that that strategy is the right one, you're going to improve it. So we never let people label their data strategy as the data strategy. We call it the first version of the data strategy, implying, in fact, explicitly saying there will be additional ones that go beyond that. We also need to establish professional roles and organizations. Remember, the goal of this seminar series is to get you guys up to a CDMP designation here, which says you've reached a certain level of knowledge, skills, and ability to be able to do this. We need to take things and say people who are working with metadata need to have specialized jobs and categories. We need to have library skills. We need to have all sorts of other things. We can't just lump them under the general category of technologist. It doesn't work. We won't have the right types of things that are out there. Same thing occurs for the stewards that are there. Again, it's fine to take somebody and say, hey, Herman, you look like a steward, right? And they'll say, me? Okay, I guess so. Does it make more money, right? Well, there you go, right, exactly. Again, what you're trying to do is to find out the first round of stewards and see how they work. And then some people will rotate off of that because they either won't like it or they won't be effective at what they're doing. And some other people who should be involved will be able to get involved in this. Again, you can see the approach here is very much iterative in that sense. Establishing the data governance and stewardship organizations. I like to establish the stewards before I do the governance organization just because the stewards can have a little practice at what they're doing. One of the funniest things to do is to go to the very first governance meeting where nobody's done anything from a data governance perspective. Okay, I guess we're here to make decisions about data. What decisions about data should we make? There's several Dilberts that cover that topic very, very well. We won't go into them right now. Again, develop approved data policies, standards, and procedures. Look specifically at the data architecture, make sure it's understandable by the business and understood by the business. And then sponsor various data management projects and services, eventually leading us to estimate what the data asset valuation is in the organization, but perhaps more associated with the cost of evolving that data. When somebody says, I need to make a change to these series of data items, we don't really at the moment have any good measures on how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost. But by doing this over and over a series of months and years and projects, you will now start to incur your own data, and you can say, are we getting better or worse at what we're doing? What are the deliverables then? Well, we have the data policies that come out of this, whatever they should be for the organization. Again, grow it slowly. What are the data standards that we're going to adopt? Most organizations don't make their own standards, but many organizations do adopt other standards and use them. There's nothing wrong with making your own standards, but most organizations simply say, well, we'll just do what everybody else is doing. On the other hand, if you're doing what everybody else is doing, you're only going to be as good as what everybody else is doing. So a little word of caution there as well. What are the unresolved issues that we have? Sometimes the issues will transcend the data governance group. It's appropriate at certain times for management to get involved in some of these things. And they need to be educated just the same way. Say, okay, well, if we want to go to this type of information and collecting this type of information on our customers, for example, or something like that, that involves some other issues on the organization. There will be things, as I said, that will transcend this. The data governance group is really going to be looking overall at the data management portfolio of projects and services and saying, what are we offering here? What should we be doing? What are we good at? Some parts of data management can be outsourced. Some parts of it absolutely shouldn't. Again, that's going to be a depends on the organization perspective. What type of data quality and information quality do we need to have in the organizations in order to do this? If I'm going to roll out a new line of business, I'll give you an example from McDonald's on this. It's not a terribly difficult one to visualize, but McDonald's has this product called McRibs. They look around and say, well, what should we send, where should we put McRibs? Well, it's in some East Coast places and some in the Midwest, but it's really not on the West Coast. And if they have data that says we're going to start selling McRibs out there, but that data is based on unknown quality data, then you have to question the decision to take McRibs worldwide throughout the whole thing. By the way, McDonald's sells beer in Europe, too. Maybe that's a decision you ought to look at domestically here. It could be an interesting play for them as well. Again, you're going to have recognized value of the data. There's no way in your organization, if somebody left a pile of organizational cash lying on a table, that anybody would put up with that, right? Oh, here's $1 million in cash just lying on a table in a conference room. Somebody would get called and said, that's valuable stuff. We don't leave that stuff lying around, but we don't have that attitude about our data yet. Now, two problems. One, we've got too much data, and two, we don't know enough about it. So by the time we get rid of the 80% of the data that we really don't need to have and get down to that 20%, then we can start to assign some values to that and say, this is more or less valuable than certain other components of the data. Who's going to be involved in this? Well, again, you're going to have the steward committees, the various types of stewards. You can see there's a couple labeled up there. It's not critical that you have all of them. But larger organizations will break their stewards up into executive stewards, coordinating stewards, and business data stewards that will be in there. You'll have your data management professionals, your executives, in some organizations the CIO, but increasingly we're seeing these data governance groups reporting up to the CEO and not through a technology function. You'll have your suppliers of data. Again, the business executives that you're working on, the IT executives responsible for the production of the data for those business executives. Again, the stewards who are responsible for that type of data. And again, let's not forget the governance, compliance, and regulation bodies that are going to be important for that as well. Finally, the consumers group, the data producers, the knowledge workers that are there, the managers, executives, data professionals, and customers. One of the areas that you can make the biggest difference in your organization from a data governance perspective is increasing the productivity of your knowledge workers. Now, in most organizations, most IT workers fall into that category, and most of your business workers fall into that category as well. If you look around, what you'll find is that most of your knowledge workers spend that same 80% of their time kind of messing with the data and changing it around and putting it in spreadsheets, trying to get it to where they want to go, and then 20% of their time actually making the decision. If you can just double their productivity, you'll be amazed at what happens in terms of the organizational productivity as well. Again, the knowledge workers here tend to do this, and the smart knowledge worker will do this once, twice, and then figure out, I shouldn't keep doing the same thing over and over again, and that's where they get their own shadow IT function from, because they'll put their own little pieces in place so that they can do this stuff outside of anybody else so that the data will always be the way they want it to be. But now you have this shadow IT that crops up on the side. What do you need in terms of data governance technologies? The first one, most important, I can't stress this enough, is an intranet website. You've got to have something out there that is a clear audience-facing. It doesn't have to face the public, but it's got to face your IT workers and your business workers in a way they can access it just by Googling internally data governance. Because if they can't find it, they will never be able to find the stories that you want to tell. Remember back to the Mizuho Securities or the chocolate story. This is where you want to put things like that, as well as the successes that you have up there. Most organizations try to tell me that that's okay. We've got a SharePoint site and it's not going to be a problem. But there's a huge difference between somebody going to a SharePoint site and downloading a PowerPoint slide versus actually putting a story out on the website that says, we solved X by applying good data governance principles. People will read this stuff. I go around different organizations, and this chocolate company is like, oh yeah, Aiken's the chocolate guy, right? He's the guy that shows up here and talks to us about chocolate stories because we had a really bad chocolate story. Email, again, you can see this is not sophisticated. There's certainly some ways of notifying people. They would have blogs that go on with it as well. The language of data governance, however, is almost always expressed as metadata. And if you're not managing metadata, and that's a topic we get to, I think, in August on this particular series, you're not going to be able to have, the governance people aren't going to have anything tangible to work with. So again, a good set of metadata tools and a good metadata repository are absolutely crucial for this. Another component is an issue management system. Again, could be something like Clarity or I forget what the old Oracle Remedy is what Oracle uses. So you can repurpose those things very, very nicely for data issues so that they are formally managed. So that the Data Governance Council can say, we considered 1,200 data issues last year. Okay, well, that's a fairly large number. That's clearly more than 2 a day, and they're clearly doing some value in terms of doing that. You may want to put together a data governance key performance indicator dashboard. Not required, but we've done a couple of these for organizations. It's the kind of thing where at least the general who's in charge of the U.S. Army can pop up and look at any point in time and see where the various units are, because when he needs a unit with special capabilities, he, in this case, factors into the unit readiness how their information management capabilities are working as well. So again, what are we looking at from a practices and techniques perspective? Let's start to get at what the value of the data is for the organization. Let's start to look at what the cost of data management should be for our organization. How much time are we spending doing scrap and rework, and how much time are we actually spending doing delivering new value? What sort of objectives are we setting for ourselves and achieving based on that? Again, I mentioned the number of decisions that were made about this. How comprehensive is our steward representation coverage? Again, if we've got 1/10 of the organization covered and we can point to several $1 million in savings, that would argue for more investment in this area that would allow us to then have increased savings in there. I mentioned the head count. Again, if we've got 200 people that are managing HR and 2 people managing data, that's probably disproportionate in there. Another component is what level of maturity are we at with respect to our data management practices. And I always toss this particular offer out. If you have an interest in this, my students back at Virginia Commonwealth University can't graduate from their classes unless they've done some aspect of assessing the maturity of organizations in there. So send us a note, and we'll be glad to put you on the list for a sort of process maturity checkup from the data governance perspective. Again, a couple of examples of data governance in action as we move to the top of the hour here. Just couple of examples here. I mentioned the U.S. military. They have a policy. The first version of this policy was actually written when I was with the Department of Defense back in the early 90s, and they've carried on since then, so more than 20 years. It has been DoD policy that data is an essential component of the type of warfare that they're doing, and that data assets shall be made visible by creating metadata. In fact, the culture of the Army made it quite easy to implement because the Army expects governance. So they looked at this and said, we're not governing that, we better do that. They saw a hole when they didn't see the data governance components that were there. In addition, the Army has a very nice breakdown in terms of how they look at these things. So for them, looking at these governance structures was pretty easy. And again, they looked at it, everything in the Army is governed from one form or another, so it was very easy for them to look at this. But what I'm getting at with this material is that these are things that you can go to for your organization and try to find these artifacts and use them as a starting point for your governance. But remember, the first time you implement it, just like any system, it's not going to be perfect. So don't say we're going to align our government with these things specifically, but we're going to think about starting from this perspective and move then based on experience, based on feedback, based on how well it works, to what would be a more appropriate structure in our organization. Again, the difference is if I say I'm going to get it right perfectly the first time and I don't, as we usually don't, then your effort becomes less credible. But if you come into it and say, I'm going to do it wrong a couple of times, we're going to make some mistakes, we're going to build it slowly and gradually over time, you have a much better perspective on all of this. So we're just about at the top of the hour here. Just a couple of quick takeaways on this. Again, the need for data governance is increasing because the amount of data that we are having to deal with as professionals is increasing, whether we're on the IT side of things or whether we're on the business side of things. Data governance is a relatively new discipline. If we actually wanted to go back and track it, we have less than 50 years experience in this area, formally managing this type of stuff. Whereas a profession like accounting literally has millennia of rulemaking behind it. So we can't say, what's the one best way to implement it? You have to look for your organization and put it in place, and you've got to conform to whatever existing constraints in there. A great way to do this is by trying on different frameworks. Think of it like going into a clothing store and trying on different outfits and seeing how they work. By the way, you do that in a dressing room, right? You don't actually do that in public in front of the entire organization. Do the same thing with your frameworks. Take a look at them in private, try them on for size, see how they fit. You'll see that data governance must end up directing the efforts of data management, and the data governance is then seen as a focal point for where these pieces come into play. And finally, the data governance organization interacts directly and indirectly with the organization. And you're going to have to find out what those pieces are to do this. And then finally, process improvement improves your data governance practices overall. Now, as we do on all these, before I turn it back over to Eileen, we give you a series of references on here. Again, Gwen Thomas's book is a terrific one that's up there. There's about 2 pages of these things that are out there. And they get added to all the time in terms of what's there. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Eileen, and we will go for questions and answers.
Great. Thank you, Peter. That was a very interesting presentation. Now it's time for a Q&A, and a lot of you have already submitted your questions, so let me pull those up. And Peter, actually, one question that was very good, you mentioned the chocolate story a bunch of times, but if you could just go into a little bit more detail of what actually happened, that might be helpful.
I'm going to put the speakerphone on the room here so these guys can hear the questions too, Eileen. The chocolate story was a story of an organization that was trying to do too much IT change at one point in time. And just like a lot of organizations, the holiday season is their biggest season. And by doing too much change at one time, they were taking chocolate and delivering the wrong orders to the wrong people. So, somebody asks for 10 pounds of chocolate and you only give them 1 pound, you've lost an opportunity for 9 pounds of chocolate sales. And vice versa, if somebody only orders 1 pound of chocolate and they get 10, it's like, what do I do with this? So the chocolate got delivered to the wrong place. And when they went back and looked at it, we were able to show them very clearly that the IT function had simply gotten overloaded at that point in time. That speaks to a best practice might be locking down your organization as you approach the holiday season. Some of you guys are very familiar with that process here. So that's what we call the chocolate story. I'll actually do that one in London again, Eileen, because we're going to do the whole series of stories at the Data Governance Conference coming up there.
Great, and let's go to the next question. For data governance meetings, does the team focus more on tactically solving problems or more strategic, that is, spinning up working groups? If working groups, how does that align with, say, a portfolio group or a PMO that initiates projects?
Well, I hate to say it depends because, unfortunately, if the group is facing some very strategic-oriented problems, then it's best to start with strategy. But there's a lot of organizations where data management is kind of rumbling along as normal, and people don't kind of notice this, in which case it might be a good opportunity to really focus on tactics and to try and improve that aspect of it as well. It really depends on what your environment is. But that's to say, you asked the question, what was first? The point is, if you start with tactics and never leave tactics and never get to the strategy, your data governance initiatives will fail because people won't understand how it plays into the bigger things that are happening in the organization. If it's seen as, there's some IT people and they want to deal with some data issues, that's interesting, but you're not going to get any respect that way. On the other hand, if you look at it and say, our goal here is to see how to use data more effectively as a strategic asset for our organization, that's clearly focused on strategy, and the organizations will start to understand that. For example, an organization might not know their customer very well and might decide that it's in their interest to get better acquainted with their customers. Well, that's clearly a data play, and that's something that's going to happen in that area as well. So again, I hate to say it depends, but what's happening right at the moment is going to be relevant to it. But if you start with strategy and never get to tactics, or you start with tactics and never get to strategy, you will not have any success at all on that. And then we've got a question here in the room. Let me go ahead and take that one if I can.
I guess when you talk about metadata repository, are you talking about a tool like doing something for the data modeling, or are you talking about something other than that?
So the question for everybody was, if we're talking about metadata repositories in here, are we talking about Irwin and things like that? Irwin, for example, is a modeling tool that we use, and Irwin has a repository for storing the models in it. And that's a place that we do want to go. But we also want to include things like the organizational glossary. Brad, for example, we've talked about things going into the metadata repository here that have nothing to do with the Irwin models at all, right? Business objectives, the measures that are going in from a BI perspective, and all sorts of other things. What we see is that almost no organization is going to have one single tool as a repository that will do everything perfectly for it, and that we're going to assemble or federate a series of tools to work well for the organization. That help you?
Yeah.
Great. Another question here in the room. Go ahead.
Yep, let's see. We have a whole bunch here.
We got one more in the room, Eileen. I'll go ahead and take that one real quick.
Okay.
Between systems, and I know earlier in the presentation you talked about converting unknown quality data into quality data. What are some of the policies and enforcement methods that can be put in place to convert data into quality data?
Well, that's actually a hard question. Let me repeat it for everybody. So they said the question is oftentimes it comes up that moving data between systems is a problem. Anytime you're moving data from one boundary to another boundary, it does afford you an opportunity. I'm going to change your question slightly and pretend we're putting data in the cloud, because that's actually one thing that everybody's doing today, but it's functionally equivalent to what you're talking about moving between systems. So if we're going to take data and put it in the cloud, it's a great opportunity to say, all right, if data's in the cloud, why are we doing this? Well, it turns out that data in the cloud should have three attributes that data outside of the cloud doesn't have. Data inside the cloud should be better quality data than data outside the cloud. After all, you would never want the reverse to be true by putting poorer quality data in the cloud. So therefore, you can say it should be of higher quality data. It implies you're going to do some sort of filtering along the way in order to get it there. It should also then, the second characteristic is it should be less in terms of volume. There just is no need to throw everything in the cloud. And if you carefully architect the data, as at least I know the group in the room here knows what that means, you can say there's no need to store multiple versions of the same data in the cloud. If we put the data out there, it should exist in one place and one place only. And finally, the data should be not just better quality, less volume, but it should be by definition more shareable. Now, what does that mean? Well, in many organizations, what that means is moving your data from a physical as-is store to a logical as-is store. Because in a logical format, more parts of the organization are going to be able to recognize and make use of your data than they would in a physical as-is implementation of it. For example, many SAP systems are focused on financial data. Well, financial data is not necessarily usable in its exact form in the other parts of the organization, but a nice series of transformations will take that up to a higher level of abstraction so that the financial data is more usable at the logical level than at the physical as-is level. But back to your question in the room here, the real thing is anytime you're doing a boundary, you have the opportunity to look, say what's going across that boundary. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist. Anybody in this room can write a couple query scripts and SQL things and things like that, just to say, this is a mandatory field and it's half empty, right? Or this is defined as not null and we've got lots of nulls in it. Those are going to be issues that you really would want to say, at least before we give this to you, let us wash it a little bit and clean it up and do some things like that. Now, the data governance organization in that context is going to be the ones that's going to say, oh, well, we need $30 million additional revenue from that, so we can't afford to do that right now because I got to get it up and running. And that's when you say, but okay, can I at least tax that individual, right? That organization that's of that $30 million. So when it is time to come back and clean it up, we can clean it up. But anytime you have a boundary involved in this, it's a really terrific opportunity to at least measure. Even if you're not able to remediate at that point, you'll go into that system and now you'll say, hey, I know you guys were expecting 100% perfect data. That turns out it's not quite that way. Is 95% good enough? That's a terrific number. We did one of these with a company that was depending on an external company to give them subscription services. They were getting, they're collecting it on a website as a third-party data and sending the data in, and their business model was to resell things to people on the subscription list. It turned out only 30% of the data that they were paying for was actually usable. Any manager can make that decision, but until you put it in a formal place and let people act on it that way, they are not going to be able to, in fact, make a good decision. If you say just the data is bad, what does that mean? But if you say only 30% of the leads you're sending us are usable, that's an actionable item that people can take on. Thanks for the question. Go ahead, Eileen, with the next one.
Great. Yes, for the next question, I think it was actually just a clarification for slide 40 with the Mizuho securities example. Should that be ineffective data management or ineffective data governance, or both maybe?
I use this as an example of data governance in that Mizuho didn't have a data governance operation running, so it was pretty ineffective. There are people who will argue that data governance is just an overall part of data management, and I don't know that they would necessarily be wrong, so you could certainly look at it from either perspective. I think the real question here is that out of this $350 million that they lost on this, that was Christmas bonus time. So, whatever it takes to make that concrete in the organization, there were an awful lot of people who were upset with this trader on this particular example.
Right.
Sure. Another question here in the room, Eileen.
So, by original sin, my past was in trade surveillance and did some work with high-frequency trading. But wouldn't a solution for that be just a simple trade surveillance, like Actimize or Mantis or tools like that, and you wouldn't necessarily go through a full-scale data governance?
In other words, the question of the room here is that there are some ways of dealing with this with one-off solutions that will actually produce this. So a lot of the trading houses have gone to this. I was looking at the article, it's 2005 when this occurred. And probably some of those products were developed in specific response to this story because it became so widespread. But if you think about it, those are, okay, I fixed that problem, but what about the next one? So the real question is, if I've got a data problem of one form or another, and I put in some technology, and there's lots of good technology that can solve lots of problems, I'm only hitting that, but I haven't actually solved the problem at the larger level, which is that nobody's maintaining control over this wonderful asset we have in the organization, the organizational data. So, yes,
Peter, are you there? Did he accidentally mute himself? No? Peter, are you still there? Are you coming back? Can't hear you right now. Well, hopefully he will be back up and running in just a few moments. I wanted to thank you all for being so understanding today with the audio issues that I heard we had, and just bearing with us and asking some really good questions. So I have all of those on my list here, and as soon as he is back up and running, we will get him to answer some more of those. And just to let everyone know, there you are.
I'm back. Yep.
Okay.
Good old iPhone and AT&T. We're going to blame this one on AT&T.
Okay. Let's see. You ready for the next question, Peter?
I sure am. Go right ahead.
Okay. Okay, so this one is there a particular data governance capability maturity model that Dr. Aiken recommends to be used to identify and communicate the need for data governance improvements?
Yeah, it's beyond the scope of this particular piece, but if you just Google data governance maturity models out there, you'll see a couple of them out there on the web that are very similar to the ones that we're using at this point. If you need something more specific, give us a shout. But the basics of data governance maturity and maturity models in general is that they follow a pattern that says that everybody gets 1 point for showing up. Well, that's kind of a nice place to start. It's kind of like getting a D and signing your name to the test, when you show up for the test. But if your process is repeatable, you get 2 points. If your process is written down and documented, you get 3 points. If somebody's managing your documented process, you get 4 points. And if periodically the group sits down and says, how's this documented managed process working for us? Now you can optimize with a feedback loop. That's where you get 5 points. So that's it in a nutshell. Do you want me to repeat that, Eileen? Was that clear?
I think that was pretty clear.
We've got papers on that, so yeah, they can send us for the papers. Actually, they can download those right off the website, can't they?
Yes, and all the sources with the links and everything is part of the presentation that everyone will get within the next 2 business days. So you should be able to get all the information presented today. And if not, then just let us know if you have any questions. The next question, research on ineffective data management investments doesn't seem like a good point for selling a data governance program. What do you think, Peter?
Yeah, the question is what works for your organization. Some organizations react very poorly to negative examples. On the other hand, the Mizuho security example is one that is absolutely widespread, and when you talk about that, almost everybody goes, yeah, we don't want that to happen to us. So it depends, again, on what works for your organization. If your organization is focused on positive stuff, then you want to emphasize the fact that, this is an asset that should be managed, and if we don't manage it, how are we going to actually leverage it the way we want to in there? But I certainly agree. I just want to make sure I show a range of alternatives that are there. That's a good point.
Okay, and next question. How can you convince a business function or section it's in their best interest to not only clean up their data, which other business sections are tripping over because of their rot, but also thoroughly defining the data? Data admins will handle the metadata documentation so that the rest of the business has a clue as to how to use the data. Do you want to read it again?
It's a good question. Really, it gets to how we communicate this in general. And there's two things that people pay attention to, pain and money. And if you can show the organization, again, these are negative examples, but it really, in most organizations, remember 70% out there are doing this very poorly in general. But if you have a way of showing that the organization, again, Mizuho Security is a perfect example, didn't pay bonuses this year because of poor data management practices, somebody's going to at least say, I kind of was dependent on my bonus. And so I want to make sure this doesn't happen again next year on that. That said, though, if you can translate some of this into dollars or whatever the local currency is, it becomes an even more powerful example. I can't tell you how many years I would talk to CIOs and C-levels and say, this stuff's important. They go, yeah, it's important. But when I tell them, well, this will make a $100 million difference in your bottom line next year, then I got their notice. By the way, the environment I'm in right now, $100 million, that's not even a rounding error for you guys. So that's a different sort of an example. But you need to have some way of being able to translate that into something that is tangible. So pain and dollars are things that people do pay attention to. We've got a couple more questions in the room. Can we jump to some of these again?
Okay, sure. We also have a lot more here.
Application development group whose job is really put in all of the checks and balances in the application before data goes into your system. So I see the value of the application development and the data administration. I'm still not able to really buy into the value of the data quality and where you really place the data quality staff or whatever and how do we justify the value. If these two groups have done their proper data admin and application development, you really need to invest in the data quality and how do you need to invest in the data quality.
So that's a very interesting question. In this particular organization that he's referring to, there's a application development group and a data administration group, and they're separate groups. And he said that if both groups had done their work well, there shouldn't be any need for data quality. And I certainly would agree with that in general. And that's one of the things that you can work toward from a data governance perspective. And again, notice I've talked in here an awful lot about communicating these aspects. Part of it is reaching out to our colleagues in app dev and saying to them, there's some things that you can put in place that will make all of our jobs easier. But if you can't give them a good reason for doing this, they're going to do the same thing they've always done, which is the definition of insanity if you're expecting different results, right? So there's definitely an outreach there. But you can also go further than that. If you look back traditionally at what we've done in data management and applications development, they've always been stovepiped, just traditionally. And ideally, where I'd like to see data quality house is over on the business side somewhere, because that's really where this stuff gets used. People in IT kind of go, all right, well, if I can get access to the database, my job is done. It's your job to fill that thing up with whatever it is. Whereas the business people do believe that we're, in fact, watching out for these things. So I think the real question is, it's got to be done where it's done. If you can get it to work in your organization, you can get your app dev guys to do this correctly, great. Then there's not even a need for a separate data group. The app dev group would just develop data-centric applications the way we'd like them to do that. It's not an easy task, though, is it? We've had a lot of communication that's gone on around this. And again, We've been developing applications for a little bit longer than we've been doing data, but we still have a long way to go in terms of.
What percentage of the organization that you have reached where you see the data quality as a separate discipline, different from data admin and application?
Reporting to the business is less than 5% at this point. Okay. It's a fairly new idea, fairly new practice in that area. Herman, you had a question real quick?
Yeah, I was wondering if we all say that data is a valuable asset. But do you see a time when it would be required balance sheet for that?
That's an interesting question. We actually talk about that periodically. So data, the question is we talk about data as an asset, but if it's really an asset, it should show up on the balance sheet, shouldn't it? And there are some moves in that area where people are starting to look at this. After all, organizational goodwill does show up on the balance sheet in many organizations now. So why shouldn't data start to show up there? I'm not aware of any organizations that have it on the balance sheet yet, but I am aware of a lot of movement in that direction, which, again, is a pretty easy thing to do, right? Not that getting there is, but once you put it there, then you can really start to say, all right, if it's managed on the balance sheet, yeah, we're going to need to pay attention to it.
And then the question becomes, well, how you arrive at what kind of algorithm would you use to value that?
I'm going to leave that one to one of my smart students to figure out. The question was, what algorithm would you use to put in that? That's one of the reasons I love being a university professor, because I can sort of hand that off to my students. So you guys work on that for a year or two and come back and tell us some answers. But it is a question of interest, absolutely. Okay, Eileen, we're ready for some more questions.
Great. When does data management fit into an organization's maturity? For example, if a group has ad hoc processes, should data management wait a bit until there's a certain level of process maturity, or are there items that need to be at a certain level of maturity?
That's a terrific question. One of the things that people look to IT in general for are what I call methods. We learn systems analysis and design methods. We learn costing methods. We learn very much change management and things like this. So they look to IT for this type of guidance. And if we start to provide this other leadership, I don't think you get nearly the resistance that people are afraid that they get on this. Again, how do you get something done? I don't know. That's something called project management. Who does that? Well, IT does that. The business doesn't really do project management. So they really do look for us to do this. So I would say that particularly if an organization is in sort of a greenfield situation where they're just starting out on this, it's a great place to lead. But again, be careful, right? Don't promise them that you're going to have everything figured out in 90 days, right? We're going to put the first version out in 90 days. We'll come back and run it for a year or two and see how it works, and we'll revise and change it appropriately. Because nobody can specify what it's going to look like for any organization in advance, right? There's no way that you can say how long it's going to take or how much it's going to cost, and it will be an evolutionary type process. But that's a really good question.
Okay, next question. In data governance, I see the principles, but I haven't seen the data governance standards. Are there any standards out there for data governance?
There's some talk about getting them in there. I think really we're still at the best practices level. Again, I'll refer you over to the DGPO, the Data Governance Professionals Organization. That's a sort of sister organization of DAMA, where those discussions are going on, but I'm not aware of standards that anybody has done, although I am aware of organizational data governance programs in organizations that have mandated standards. Again, sort of silly, but, you know, we would have avoided a lot of Y2K playing if in the 1990s and 80s we had simply said, let's all use a 4-digit date code. That's a governance issue, very definitely.
And the next question. We have a number of end-user systems being used for enterprise data gathering, storage, and reporting to state and federal agencies, all outside of the data management governance guidelines. As you mentioned, some of the work done to create and manage these end-user systems is exemplary, but how do we convince management enterprise applications and systems should be consistent with the accepted standards?
The easiest way to do that is to show the amount of variability from system to system. Believe it or not, I've walked into organizations where they've had 2 stovepipes that have been working really carefully, stovepipes, and then they try to put their data together and it doesn't work out so well. You can put a dollar cost on that. How long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost? You can go back and look at the cost of these things and help come up with cases for it, but also say, you know, did you really mean by design to put in place systems that were not interoperable? And of course, everybody will say, no, of course we didn't mean to do that. I say, well, that's what your current practices are allowing you to do, or permitting you to do, in fact, forcing you to do. Again, we're working with some big systems back on the East Coast right now for the armed forces, and they have 3 separate contractors developing 3 different sets of metadata for 3 separate systems that are all supposed to work together. And then they're going to come back and put it together at the end. Well, you know what? That's something we as taxpayers should just be furious about, because it not only hurts our armed forces in terms of making sure that they've got the right information that they need to have, but it also is problematic from a taxpayer perspective of just simply paying people to do things incorrectly. And that's some of the language that you have to start using too, and say, all right, that's the way we've done it in the past, or that's the way we've always done it, and that guarantees that your systems will not be able to interoperate. And after management hears that a couple of times, they'll go, all right, I guess we better not do that anymore.
Okay. Well, we have about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more questions left before the session is coming to an end. Could you talk more about data quality from the checklist slide? I believe that was number 35.
So we do a whole session of this on data quality, and I'm not sure what they want me to talk about, but again, if at the moment your organization doesn't practice data quality, then it is fair to label all the data in your organization as unknown quality. And what you'd like to do is to say, do you really want to make your decisions that are being made organizationally based on unknown quality data? That lesson usually will get to people pretty quickly. More detail on that, one of the things that people, I guess, forget very often is that there's 2 types of data quality. We've got data that's from an operational perspective where we're doing edit checks, input filtering, and things like that. But then there's also the structure in which data is kept in the organization, and that can tremendously impact the quality of which the data is able to be used by the organization. If you're aggregating or disaggregating too far, you may end up with some very, very interesting types of results there that aren't seen as data quality problems, but really do come down to data quality problems on that. I'm afraid I'll have to refer you to one of our papers on that for more detail, or get in touch with us, and we can dive into that in a little bit more detail. But I know you're running out of time, Eileen. Go ahead with the next question.
Yes. So why does it seem to be that most often IT drives a data governance program rather than the business?
I would have said that was the case 3 years ago, but our data governance conference that we've been running for the past 3 years on this has actually got about 2/3 business and 1/3 IT in it. And it's gone so popular that we're actually adding a 3rd event this year in September for that. So I don't know that that statement's true anymore, although I think it certainly was true. But I do think that the business is getting it. We're seeing an awful lot of business interest in this topic.
Okay, next question. What is the source of the claim that 70% of organizations do not realize a positive return on data management?
So I've done a lot of research in this area. Let me see if I can get to that one slide that everybody inevitably focuses in on. There we go, number 40. And when you say the source of it, what I do is that I have gone and done very specific measurements on more than 500 organizations. And again, there's some papers on our website that will summarize the research for you. Again, as a university-based place, we don't publish white papers. We publish academically refereed papers on this. Again, I'd be glad to send you a copy of that so that you can take a look at it. But again, it is grounded in science, not just a wild, sophisticated guess that comes out of nowhere.
Okay, and the next question. Just real briefly to review, was availability part of data governance?
I'm sorry, was availability?
Yes. Is part of data governance the availability?
That's the question. Part of data governance.
Availability, yeah. I'm not sure what that means. What are they really trying to ask?
Availability, I guess.
Oh, okay. Availability of thank you. Okay, good. Thank you for helping on that. All right. Again, they're going to depend from organization to organization, but if your business is solely focused on a website and the website's down, then making sure that data availability is going to be key. So again, different organizations are going to have different needs around it. Not all of your data is going to fall into a high availability need on that. I remember I saw some forms here at one point where there's a high availability system and things like that. Okay, now I got it. Going to depend from organization to organization, though, yeah.
Okay, great. So it looks like we're right at the top of the half hour, and we wanted to just respect everyone's time since it was scheduled for an hour and a half. Whatever questions we did not get to answer live today, we will send out to you as part of the follow-up message that will come to you in the next 2 business days. So thank you, everyone, for participating in today's event. Hopefully you have enjoyed it. Thanks again to Dataversity and Shannon for hosting us. And once again, you will receive the materials in the next 2 business days. Next month, we will focus on data information architecture, building a solid foundation, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for that as well. All our webinars are now complimentary, and as always, feel free to contact us if you have any more questions. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks, Eileen.
Thanks.